Hello, I'm Jan Swafford, and what I'm supposed to say is, this is living the classical life.
Today we travel to Rosendal, a small Norwegian coastal village of about 800 people and nestled in an area known for its fjords, jagged mountains, wild waterfalls, and a closeness to a particularly stark beauty of nature ideal for reflection and rejuvenation. It's here at the 17th century manor house at Barony Rosendal that we caught up with the American composer and author Jan Swafford, particularly known in the musical world for his biographies of Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms and Ives, and we discussed his particularly emotional attachment to the great musical personalities that he brought to life in his books. Our adventure here to the Rosendal Chamber Music Festival, founded by the Norwegian pianist Leif Ove Ansnes, is funded in part by you, our viewers, and we thank you for watching the show. Jan, thank you so much for being on the show. Welcome to Living the Classical Life. Here we are in this 13th century kitchen, which is such an extraordinary setting here at the Rosendal Festival.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So one of my favorite stories is that in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, you and a friend went on a road trip and you stood at the edge of a cliff in the middle of the Grand Canyon and you debated whether the totality of what you were experiencing was best represented by Brahms' Fourth Symphony or the Ives' Fourth Symphony, if I got that correctly.
You got that correct, and that was Jan Gippo, who ended up as Piccolo of St. Louis Symphony.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So the question is, did you come up with a verdict,
of course not.
And did you remain friends?
Yes, we did, but it was a music student argument. That's what it was. He was still at New England Conservatory, and I was just out of college. It's the kind of thing that music students yell at each other about. But we stayed friends, and what was wild was the idea that I would end up writing biographies of both those people, Ives and Brahms, would have just been completely incomprehensible.
But you were clearly drawn to their music from an early age. How did that happen? Were you from a musical background, first of all?
My family is weirdly musical. I didn't realize that for a long time. Not professionally, though, but my grandfather sang in the church choir his whole life. My cousin Terry was a kind of prodigy on piano and flute, and I had two piano teachers in the family. So it was, and my mother had played in college, and she was very interested in music and took me to programs. And there were astonishing programs in Chattanooga, Tennessee in those days. There were a traveling concert series that had Bernstein and the Philharmonic and Van Cliburn and Robert Merrill and the Joffrey Ballet. It was really kind of astounding in Chattanooga, and that changed my life.
So how did it go from your upbringing in Chattanooga to going to I understand that some of your writings about music started for pragmatic reasons. You needed to make a living, but then you also went into composing. So,
well, I just wanted to be a composer. I went to Harvard, and that's what I wanted to do. But I really didn't have very much of an idea about how to go about doing it. So I got off to a very slow start. I majored in music at Harvard, and it was a very musicology-oriented program. Mm-hmm. I had 2 years of music history at Harvard. The first year stopped at 1600, and the second year stopped at 1850. Uh-huh. And that was the way Harvard was in those days.
No kidding. So, going through those programs in those years, what did it even seem like to you to have a life in musicology, studying music theory, music history?
I was not a musicologist. I wanted to be a composer. I'm not a dilettante composer. I'm a dilettante musicologist. So, but in high school, for a while, in junior high and high school, I wanted to be what I thought was the epitome of a musical career, which is to be a high school band director. Because I had grown up, my mother taught at the high school that I went at, and they had a famous high school marching band. And the great ambition of my life was to be in the City High Marching Band, which I eventually was. And that's what I wanted to do. But then gradually I started writing music, I started playing piano, and then I began learning more and more of the repertoire, and I started with, Brahms and Copland, and then gradually expanded from there. And by the time I ended high school, I just wanted to write music, but I had written very little and didn't really know what was involved.
Well, let's start there and talk about your life as a composer. You've described yourself as a chameleon. What do you mean by that?
I adapt myself to what I'm doing and often end up writing very different kinds of music for different purposes. My mainstream music is very expressive. It's very cognizant of history. But I've written music for a couple of Greek plays, and that's just a whole different world. I've written for a Bert Brecht play, Good Woman of Szechuan, which is sort of neo-court viol, and when I was writing in my early 20s, I was just using thousands of notes and writing huge, massive splashes of sound, and then I decided I was using up my notes too fast. I only have a certain number of notes to write your life. I was using them up too fast. And I decided I wanted to be expressive, and that was a whole different thing. So I've changed a lot, and I'd say my goal as a composer now, coming back to it after many years of writing biography, is I want to get back to the wildness of your early pieces and yet know what I'm doing.
Did you feel you were able to follow your own distinctive voice in the sense that you could recognize it for yourself? What I'm trying to get at is you've spent so much time immersed in the works of Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart, and Ives. Were you not at least a little bit influenced by these great masters?
No, because most of music I wrote was before I started writing biography. And since then, I'm waiting to see what they're going to do for me. A lot of my music, though, is very influenced by nature. It has titles like Midsummer Variations and Landscape of Traveler. And I'm an old hiker. I've been in Grand Canyon a lot. I've been all over the Northeast. And landscape and music have always seemed to me wedded. And the experience of music and landscape to be wedded. So that was my main inspiration. The thing is, when you've spent 20 years living with people like Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms, you learn some things, and I'm waiting to see what I've learned.
I didn't realize the extent to which this also applied to Brahms until I became familiar with what you were talking about, his inspiration through landscape. I didn't know about this.
Yes, and Brahms was much more personal in his music than he wanted to admit, and that history has looked at him at. History has wanted to look at Brahms as purely abstractionist and, a composer free of autobiography and things like that. Well, he wasn't, and he knew he wasn't, but he didn't really want to talk about it. He said to somebody once, "I don't like to hear people say that the Requiem is about my mother." Well, that's his way of saying it is about my mother, but I don't want to hear about it.
So let's talk about just zooming out in your work as an author, and you've written these biographies that have become so mainstream. How do you decide which composers you're going to write about? Did you already feel going in that you had enough of a sense of these composers' lives that you needed to come up with some new survey of their lives? Brahms and Beethoven, they've been written about exhaustively.
Well, that's an interesting question because I'm completely different than everybody else. I wrote the Ives biography. I knew a lot about Ives. My honors thesis at Harvard was about Ives' fourth, which was a very weird thing to do in 1968.
That's bold.
And I had been working for a magazine and wrote an article about Ives for them, and there was a guy there, and it just sort of developed, why not do a proposal for a biography of Ives? And I knew that nobody had understood Ives properly. I knew that. And I just said, and I finally did, and I got almost no money for it, but I got a couple of grants. And that is the book that is still closest to me, and I think it's my best, because that's a book that really needed to be written. Brahms and Beethoven don't need my help. Ives needed to be explained. Ives needs explaining, and nobody had explained him well. So, and he was an incredible character to write about. He's a marvelous, marvelous person. The others were, I have to say, they were just blowing in the wind things that blew into my lap. I wrote a book called The Vintage Guide, an introduction, which went very well. The publishers liked it. And they said, name a composer and we'll hire you to write a book about him. And I said, well, it really hasn't been a particularly good Brahms biography, I don't think. And they said, okay, do that. So I did.
What does the research look like for such a project? I mean, that must be massive. You're probably scouring archives and libraries and traveling around to different cities.
Yes, except it's so different with each of them. Ives is mostly one library at Yale. That's where all his papers are, yeah, and his manuscripts. And in Connecticut, New York is where he lived. So my Ives bookshelf was about 1.5, library was about 1.5 bookshelves. Brahms, there's a fair amount of writing, but it's not enormous. My Brahms book library is about 3 bookshelves plus the scores. My Beethoven library was about 2 bookcases, plus massive amounts of German research and things like that I got. And when I did a tour and I was in Bonn, and I found this 60-volume scholarly series of studies about Bonn, which had just fabulous information that had never been in English before about it. Not about Beethoven, but about the town and about the people and about his teacher, Nefe. I was very interested in the Illuminati, who I knew were big. What I didn't know is that Beethoven's teacher, Nefe, was the head of the Illuminati Lodge, okay, which was a very interesting situation. And there was a lot in this material about Nefe and the Illuminati. So, yeah, the thing is, though, that with Ives, you could sort of read all the papers, and there were not many books at that point, and so that was that. And Brahms was not a huge amount of material and research, so you felt like you could sort of look at most of it. Beethoven, the amount of sheer material is overwhelming.
That's my sense of it.
And you just have to say at some point, I have to stop. I can't keep going forever. And Mozart there's not nearly as much writing about Mozart as there is about Beethoven, actually.
I didn't know that. But you mentioned that you have a different approach than others. So let's say you're starting out one of these massive volumes.
They aren't supposed to be massive. They get that way.
How do you decide the tone that you're going to adopt? I mean, what kind of audience do you anticipate when you go into writing that big Brahms biography?
Well, let me say something else first, because you were sort of asking a question that I didn't quite answer. You know, you have an angle. Everybody asks me that. What's your angle on Mozart? What's your angle? And the answer is I have no angle. As soon as I sign the contract, I say, I don't know anything. I know nothing. I'm going to wipe out as much as I can, everything I think I know about this person, and start over from scratch based on the research. And I learned that from the Ives. I was sort of an Ivesian. I knew a lot about Ives. I had studied him. I'd written about him. And I discovered in the process of writing the book that most of what I thought I knew was either wrong, incomplete, or irrelevant. And all the good ideas came from the research. And that's when I said, I'm going to start over from scratch. You can't really do that, but you try. So I have no angle. The angle comes from doing the research, and it gradually accumulates. In terms of the style of the book, I try to match the style of the book to the person I'm writing about. So my Ivesian book is Ives' book is Ivesian. It has 4 different kinds of chapters. It has massive endnotes, including a hysterical story about my high school band, where the band director had us, for what reason, I don't know, learn the Star Spangled Banner in 2 different keys. And in the first football game, he forgot to tell us which key and started conducting, and we started playing in 2 keys. And then everybody realized what happened, and everybody switched, and we were still in 2 keys. And then it's very hard to play a wind instrument when you're laughing your head off. So it was, and Ives would have absolutely adored that, so I put it in the notes. And then I did Brahms, and that was not right for Brahms. And I think some people were disappointed in the Brahms because they figured that Ives was the way I write biography, with all these, different kinds of chapters and very informal. And
yeah.
But no, I have no way I write biography. I write based on my subject, and I try to. So the Brahms was much more restrained. It was craftsmanly, and then Beethoven was an often very acerbic person. He was a very capricious person. So that led in a different direction. There was more musical analysis in the Beethoven, just because I had more to say. And then Mozart, I found myself laughing more than I ever had writing a book because of him. His letters he was hilarious. And I realized that my prose was coming out lighter and looser and sometimes funnier with him, and that's because of him. So I don't plan the story, the structure of the book. I don't think a biography is a piece of literature. Mm-hmm. And I don't want it to be literary. I just want it to be more like life. And the high points and the low points are what I think. And I don't believe in interpretation. Mm-hmm. I mean, most people think that a biography is an interpretation of a life. I have a moral objection to that, which is that people don't live their lives in order to be interpreted by somebody else for money.
What a way to put it. I love that.
And the bits of interpretation in my books are things that seem to me to just be obvious. And in the case of Brahms, for example, his self-knowledge I felt was very reliable. So a lot of what seems like analysis of him in the books is just me echoing what he said about himself, because he knew himself very well. Beethoven, not so much.
Mm-hmm. But let's take Ives for a minute. Mm-hmm. You mentioned him as a marvelous character, but what is it about his music that so resonated with you that you became the self-professed Ivesian? So when I was in high school in Boston, we had a music appreciation guy come in and he says, I was the precursor to the Car Talk show, and here I am, I'm going to do kind of the same thing for you with records. And one of the things, he puts on Ives' Second Symphony, which some people would say that's maybe one of the more accessible works. And so he put that on and he kind of watched our faces and he says, so how does that piece sit with you? And we kind of looked at each other and he's kind of atonal, maybe not so comprehensible, right? And then he says, well, to my ears, this sounds completely tonal. This sounds completely like the language I would speak. And
It is. That's the Second Symphony.
Yeah.
Well, Ives is a hero of mine, as probably by age 15 already. And for this is the way things happen when you're a teenager. I was looking at a magazine, and they had Bernstein's recording of Ives II. And there was a famous picture of Ives, just this stark face. And I just looked at it and I said, I like that face. I like that name. I bet I'll like that music. So I went out and bought, as it happened, 3 places in New England, which is sort of, oh my God.
Yeah.
But I just kept listening to it, and he became a hero of mine because he was so independent, and he was very much on his own path, and I admired that. So, in a way, he was my first great musical hero.
So if you've spent all this time writing your books, you've immersed yourself in the process, you probably your writing process, maybe you have these obsessive stretches where you don't really see daylight for a while. What I'm trying to get at is, do you ever have a moment with any of these composers at all that you may have come across a document, a letter, or even just an object where you felt really close to that person, almost as though you had met them? That you had some special insight and you said, I really feel close to the essence of that composer.
I feel that a lot, actually, but it takes a while. You have to learn how they talk. And somebody said about Ives once, one of his neighbors, he said, it's hard to quote Ives because what he said was not what he meant. And you have to learn how he talks. And Brahms said, about his letters, I only write half sentences. The reader has to supply the other half. And I felt nobody had tried to supply the other half of Brahms' sentences. And at a certain point, I learned what Ives meant when he said some weird things. And Brahms, here's a good example. It's kind of funny, actually. There's a letter he wrote to Edward Hanslick, the great conservative critic and Wagner basher, who was a friend of Brahms.
Right.
And Hanslick was the real leader of the Brahmsians, not Brahms. And Brahms and Hanslick wrote a famous pamphlet called Beauty in Music, which was a great statement of music as pure sound and not connected to anything and abstraction. And I knew that the first time that when Brahms first tried to read that, he wrote Clara Schumann. I tried to read it and it had so much stupid stuff in it that I couldn't read it. So he wrote Hanslick this letter, which Hanslick proudly quoted in a memoir. And I said, is Brahms being a hypocrite here? He's writing this letter saying how great beauty and music is. And then I read it more carefully, and I realized he's putting it down in every sentence in a very subtle way. He's saying things like, every sentence of yours leads one to think further, which is to say, you don't go very far. And at the end, he says, I think you should give us further thought of your thoughts on other subjects, meaning don't do this kind of stuff anymore. You're not really that good. And Hanslick thought it was a letter of approval because he didn't know how Brahms talked.
When you spent your time with their perhaps actual character, if we can call it that, from their documents and their compositions, was there anything that surprised you about maybe the broadness of their emotional range, let's put it that way?
Well, one of the things surprised me, when you read Brahms was so funny, and his irony was so subtle in his letters and conversation. And I got to Beethoven, and I said, he's so kind of blunt compared to Brahms. But I discovered that Beethoven could actually be quite funny and quite charming. I didn't realize that. Mm-hmm. I mean, he could be charming and turn on you on a dime, but he still could be very charming. Mozart, I just had not realized how profoundly funny he was. What a marvelous guy, what a Mr. Joie de Vivre. And I already knew that all the myths about Mozart weren't true. He was not buried in a pauper's grave. He wasn't poor. He wasn't starving and neglected. It's a bunch of baloney. He was the most respected composer alive, paid as well as anybody. Mm. And if he had lived 10 more years, he would have been the supreme composer. But surprise, I mean, that's a good question. I guess I was a little surprised at how much I just got a kick out of Mozart. As a human being, he was a mensch. He was a real human being. He was not a geek. He was totally absorbed with music, but he was genuinely interested in other people. Mozart, when he met you, wanted to know who you were, where you came from, and he was really interested. I get very emotional about Ives. I mean, I often choke up just talking about him. And you probably haven't read the Ives book.
I have not, no.
I was working on the book, doing research, and Jim Sinclair in New Haven called me and said, you got to come down here, I just found something. When John Kirkpatrick, who was the great champion of Ives and premiered the Concord Sonata, moved out of his house, he was getting gaga at that point. Jim found under his piano a manila envelope with the love letters that Harmony Ives wrote to him when they were recording. And they're absolutely beautiful. Some of the most beautiful love letters in the world. And I just sat typing those up with tears pouring down my face for a week.
Well, then now I have to read your book.
Well, that really was the turning point in that book, when I began to really get past what I had thought and to really what he was about. And then basically they developed a kind of theology between them, that they were both, she was more conventionally religious. Her father was a minister. He was kind of universally religious. But their idea was that human love is a version of God's love. And his music was, still joking, his music was going to be their way of spreading divine love into the world through their love. And that explains so much about his music.
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing that.
I guess I was surprised at how lovable he actually was in the end, because I'd considered him cranky and eccentric, and I came to feel he was just a marvelous human being, deeply eccentric, but marvelous, generous, open-minded, even-handed, and he supported a lot of American new music for years. He spent a lot more money on other people's music than his own. So I guess that was the big surprise, how I ended up just finding him a marvelous person.
So we talked about these composers from the standpoint of their character. Let's talk about their music, looping back to your perspective as a composer. Mm-hmm. You've talked a lot about musical revolutionaries, the heroes, the innovators. I'm wondering if you felt that a composer needs to be innovative in order to be great.
No. In a word, no. And I think the great example, to me, the supreme composers in Western music are Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart, and they're three completely different kinds of composers. Yeah. Bach was considered old hat in his own lifetime, old-fashioned. He was still devoted to counterpoint. And his sons, meanwhile, were creating the new classical style. And they called Dad the old wig. That was their name for him. Mozart was au courant. He was a person of his time. He was not revolutionary. He accepted the norms of society and music in his time. He did, my line in Mozart is he went through convention and came out the other side. And Beethoven I don't think he was a revolutionary. I call him a radical evolutionary, because he was not trying to overthrow the past. Everything he did was founded on the past. But his time perceived him as a revolutionary. So we have three composers who were considered outdated, au courant, and revolutionary, and they're the three great composers in our tradition. And the modernist idea that you have to be revolutionary to be good is just something I never accepted. And in graduate school, I saw all these petit revolutionaries running around, and I just said, this is silly. Yeah. It's nonsense.
Yeah, I was surrounded by that too, and that made me more curious about the examples of composers who weren't necessarily revolutionary in any sense, but who had the content. So if I'm looking at the symphonies of Schumann, for example, not particularly innovative, but I really, at the same time, love them for what they are, yeah. and they're at the same time masterful. I'm thinking about other composers these same friends of mine who looked down on these non-revolutionary composers, they would particularly give a bad rap to, for example, Rachmaninoff, who at the end of his life kind of lamented. He said, well, people would accuse me of being old-fashioned, old hat, but what I say is that maybe the message of music always remains the same. And that's a statement, regardless of what you feel about his music. That phrase really guided me through other composers.
No, I agree with it. And Sibelius is another one. And I think Sibelius quit partly because Stravinsky and Schoenberg were there, and he really respected Stravinsky, at least, as Sibelius did. And I think he just said, I'm not going to try. I'm not going to keep doing this. But so he was backward looking, but nonetheless, he was singular. He was a unique figure, and that's what's significant. It's your notes that are significant. I spent the whole Eroica lecture that I did today at the festival talking about the Eroica and all this enormous backstory of how it started as a ballet, about creatures brought to life and then enlightened by art, and then that became a piano piece, which became a symphony about Napoleon. And I finally said, this is really extraordinary. This is a piece that changed music for various reasons. But if the notes weren't good, it wouldn't make any difference. And if the notes are good, it doesn't make any difference whether you're revolutionary or not. The trouble is that the modernist myth said that all important art is revolutionary and it's anti-establishment, and that's just ridiculous. Some artists, Beethoven got on Goethe for sucking up to the aristocracy, which he did, and Mozart was not radical in any way. People tried to paint him that way because that was the coin of the realm for a while. I never believed that coin of the realm. It's just how good your notes are.
I'm looking from my perspective now as a performer. I bet you hear feedback from performers who have read your writings, and I've met performers who say that all the cues we need as performers of this great music, all of it is in the music. You don't need anything else. And then other people, and I fall into that second camp, where I say the context it's all about that context. It's so important for me to live into the world of that music and how it arose. What's your feeling about the impact that you have on performers?
Well, I have a sort of different take on what your attitude is, which is, as a performer, the idea that you should ignore everything but the notes, I just don't agree with that at all. What I think you should do is read everything there is. You should do the theory, you should do the analysis, and everything adds into what you're doing and inflects it. For example, in Beethoven, when I hear Beethoven, I hear him at a particular time and place in his life and in his music, and I think your performance should be aware of that. to play Opus 1 piano, the first piano sonata, the way you play the late music is nonsense, and you have to understand what he had gone through, what the music had gone through, and that's. I had an incredible experience once. I was watching the Emerson Quartet. I don't know if this is relevant or not, and there was a student group playing Ravel, the Ravel Trio, and the cellist of the Emerson Quartet said, "Stop." It was a master class, and he said, when you play piano, the piano dynamic, you're playing a Beethoven piano. Here's a Ravel piano. And suddenly his sound became diaphanous and ethereal. That's a Ravel piano. This is a Beethoven piano.
Okay.
And you need to know those things.
Yeah. So it's one thing to have your work impact the performer, and maybe the added context will inform their performance a little bit more, but has it ever happened to you that you as the author will hear a performance that kind of has you reconsider something, or at least of course something will deeply impress you?
Of course,
Yeah.
Sure, all the time. I could cite half a dozen times in this festival. For example, when they did the Archduke, a piece I've never felt I've never felt moved by. I felt interested in, but not so much moved by. But the pianist started, instead of the usual grand da-dee-da-da, he started very intimately, and that I just suddenly got a different take on that whole thing. And what was another piece where Life Ova started something that is usually started very aggressively? It was the beginning of the first of the Opus 1 number 3, Opus 2 number 3, Opus 1 number 3 C minor trio. He started it gently and then built where it does not want, and that was very interesting to me. And what happens at the beginning changes a lot. Beethoven knew that very well. Beethoven is so much about what happens right at the beginning and the way that resonates all the way to the end of the piece.
I'm sure that you have found additional information along the way after you've completed things, and maybe you feel like, oh, I wish I had added that in.
You bet.
And what I'm getting at is there a sense that every, say, couple of decades, there needs to be a reevaluation, a new biography about any given composer? Would you feel compelled to put out another edition of one of your...
I don't think so, but that's partly because of my age. I want to write some more music before I leave the scene. And besides, I spent about 20 years writing about German composers. It's enough. Also, I think if there's genuinely new stuff, it makes sense to do that. I'll give you an example. After the Brahms was written, I had a gig with the Toronto Symphony under Peter Ungen with the Third Symphony. He was doing a presentation, a kind of, talk and play the symphony. And then sitting around talking with him, I came to a realization of that piece that I hadn't had before, which is how completely autobiographical it is. He starts off with a Robert Schumann theme. He's quoting Schumann. And for Brahms, when you quote Robert, Robert is there in the music. Mm-hmm. And he ends with this beautiful, that theme. You may have to remember the end of that symphony. The theme comes back from the first movement and it's slowly descending. And I realized it's descending in what are called horn fifths, this very particular harmony, which is quoting the beginning of the Beethoven Farewell Symphony. And what he's saying is, farewell, Robert. Into all that mess, and glorious mess when you went crazy and I was in love with your wife, and that became famous overnight because of you. He was saying, okay, goodbye to all that and farewell.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. That's pretty
incredible.
I
wish I'd had that in the book.
And finally, Jan, what's inspiring you these days in life in general?
I have an orchestra piece to write for the 50th anniversary of Orchestra New England in New Haven. I'm very excited about that. Don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm very excited about it. I want to get back to more hiking because I don't have a book hanging over me for the first time in 20 or 25 years. I'm not going to write any more books unless I write, crime novels or something. I want to write for fun. And I want to enjoy my time, and I want to get out in the woods and travel, things like that. It's old guy stuff.
Jan, thank you so much for this conversation and for being on the show. It was such a delight for me.
Oh, it was fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much.